Hello, friend. We are at the Old South Carriage. We're gonna do a haunted ghost tour, and this big fellow may be our guide.
Possibly from the 1680s. However, the oldest headstone you will find here is to the Simmons family, buried in 1695. So yes, it's very, very old. In fact, there's actually a spirit here that's probably older than all the other ones that we have here. It's actually called the Wailing Woman. The Wailing Woman is a spirit you will hear between the hours of 12 a.m. to dawn. You'll notice there's no tours here past 12 a.m. There are tours here up to 12 a.m. However, that's because of a city ordinance basically saying that after 12 a.m. there shouldn't be anybody out here. Locals don't really care for it, understandable. But there's also a superstition here in Charleston that between 12 a.m. to dawn, that's when the veil between the spiritual and our world is the thinnest. So, of course, people tend to be a little bit more superstitious. They won't come out here at night. If they do have to walk by this graveyard at night, they'll actually walk over here and then walk back over there to basically go about their go about their night. Now, as it turns out, if you happen to find yourself here, you might see a woman wandering around that grassy area, crying profusely. That's also her. So, the oldest stories I have of the Wailing Woman, they say that in the 1803 to about 1817 or so, there's a series of stories about children sneaking out of their parents' houses and hanging out near this graveyard, and they would throw headstones, they would throw stones at the headstones, they would have sticks and run around with them and basically just cause a bunch of disrespect. They say that a woman would appear from behind a headstone. She was visibly crying, and she would tell them to stop. They're being disrespectful to the dead. Now, of course, these kids were already very disrespectful anyway, so they just gave her some more attitude. It is said that these kids then were picked up by this woman over the fence. She would pluck them over into the graveyard, and she'd drag them through there and throw them over in that grassy area. It didn't hurt them, just enough to scare them. Now, this is actually not the most recent tale of this. In fact, 5 years ago, there was a story about 5 college students coming out here. They were doing some college student activities, and they happened to hear a woman crying here. Now, instead of calling somebody and having them come over and check it out themselves, like I said, because of those college student activities, they thought, let's just jump over the fence. You know, it's fine. So they say there's one kid that got stuck on the fence, got stuck on one of the fence posts, and couldn't quite free himself. Kind of gave up after a second, and he felt these hands grab him by the shoulder, pull him over the fence into the graveyard. He then felt himself being dragged through the graveyard. He woke up about 20 minutes later, staring up at the stars in that grassy area. Now, at this point, he walked back over to the fence where he saw the police with his friends. His friends had been looking for him. They said they couldn't find him for quite a while. And when the police saw him, they were going to arrest him for trespassing, but when they realized that he had been dragged through the graveyard by the Wailing Woman, they thought that was punishment enough, and they just kind of let him go with a warning this time. Now, I don't know how true that last part is, but I do know it's a very popular part of the story, because even to this day, people will actually sometimes hear somebody crying here at night. I myself have heard somebody crying here at night. Now, by the way, hand to God, meaning I'm not joking, I've actually heard somebody crying here. Me and my roommate were walking down this road. We were actually parked right over here. We heard we thought was somebody crying. Now, where I come from, if you hear somebody crying in the middle of the night, no, you didn't. That's not your business. No, just keep on walking. That's not your business. So I was about to go about my night, but my roommate, she's from the suburbs of Washington, D.C., she didn't grow up with the same type of stories I did. And she was convinced this was a person in distress. Now, as somebody who has found more than a couple people in distress in the middle of the night, they're not exactly calm, they're hysterical, reasonably so. But I also know that people in distress don't just sit there and cry. So to prove it to her, I went over to the fence. And I actually leaned over the fence a little bit, and I screamed, does anybody need help with them? By the way, this is my inside voice, so you can imagine what my outside voice is like. So, I heard nothing, except for more crying. And I looked right at my roommate, and I said, just saved you. You almost got by a spirit. Let's go home. We got my car and we went home. Now, I know it sounds kind of weird, but in fact, a lot of people have this belief here in Charleston as well. It's basically this idea that spirits can mimic human speech. They can mimic crying. They can mimic, calling out your name. They can even mimic the very voices of your dead relatives, your most beloved ones too. In fact, when I was growing up, I was always told that these types of things were to entice children out into the woods, and that's where they would get you. What do you mean by get you? What do they do? I don't know. I was a smart kid growing up. I didn't question it. I mean, I would look out the window, and then I would go right back to bed. That's as much as we did. No. In fact, my favorite story, my mom told me, she's like, I was like 8 years old or something like that, and I said, what happens if you go out to the graveyard? What happens if you go out into the woods in the middle of the night while they're calling your name? And she says, I don't know. I know that one day my brother, though, went out there, never saw him again. And I said, I don't have an uncle. She's like, and you never did meet him, did you?
No.
I know, right? And to make it even worse, my grandmother played into the story. My grandmother never had a son. But man, she convinced me that she did. She said, oh, Billy, I remembered him. It turned out later, years, I thought I had an uncle for years. Turns out, no, it was just a story. Just to scare me, prevent me from going out in the woods at night. You know, understandable. So, what's kind of interesting about the Wailing Woman is that she's very common here. People talk about her all the time. People, she's actually become a bit of a, I guess you'd say, like an icon of this neighborhood. So what is it with the grassy area? The area that she's often seen crying in? Well, it's actually a mass grave site. This mass grave site was built for yellow fever victims in 1713. It turns out there were up to 300 people dying a day because of yellow fever. They couldn't keep up with the amount of dead. So what they did was they dug a trench grave. This trench extends underneath the mausoleum, goes all the way to this first white line here in the road. So it is said that there are up to 2,000 people buried here, and according to legend, a woman had 4 children who all died of yellow fever around the same time. And she would visit here every single day to pay her respects. You'd hear her crying in the daytime. You'd hear her crying here at night. She was always here. So eventually, this place was overfilled. They had to top it off. They had to build another mass grave across town. That's when the Wailing Woman died. In fact, they were going to bury her across town. The townspeople were too afraid she'd become a malevolent, angry spirit. They thought it would make more sense to bury her with her children. So they did. In fact, they say she's a guardian of that graveyard, and she's only there because her children are there. And she will guard it forevermore, because not only is she trying to guard it for her children, she's guarding it for everybody who's buried there. That's why here in Charleston, we always say, show some respect to the dead. Don't go over into the graveyard and the cemeteries and be disrespectful, because someday, you're going to be there too, and you're going to feel how those spirits feel. You're going to want a little bit of respect to your memory, that's all. Good boy. By the way, this is a very death-positive carriage. If you're afraid to talk about death, this is not the place to be. Yeah, my favorite thing to remind people is the memento mori. Remember that someday you will die. So, that being said, is anybody staying here at this hotel? Nobody? Probably for the best. So, Mills House. This is actually the oldest hotel here in Charleston. It's actually one of the few buildings that have survived the Great Fire of 1861. Survived for 2 reasons. First place had running water, and in fact, headquarters of P.T. Beauregard, leader of the Confederate Army. So, the night of December 11th, P.T. Beauregard, sitting on that balcony, happened to look down Queen Street. Saw there was a fire coming from the Cooper River heading in this direction. He orders his men to wake up all the hotel guests, have them soak their bed linens, blankets, towels, tapestries, running water that was here. And then took all those soaking materials, put them over the windows, the sides, doorways, what have you, anything flammable. The idea was to keep the internal temperature of the building low, maybe save everybody inside. This was a big deal. Everybody in this building survived. Fire of 1861, largest fire in Charleston's history, burnt down 3/4 of the town, killed 500 people. The fact that everybody here survived, a bit of a miracle. You're probably wondering, it can't be haunted. Nobody died there. It is. Say if you'll spend the night here, you'll hear a person knocking on the door. And if you answer, you'll see a man in a Confederate officer's uniform ask you if you have any spare blankets or bed linens. Now, if this happens to you, got a couple of words of advice. It's going to sound silly. It's supposed to. Essentially, look at them in the eyes. Ask them what the Wi-Fi password is. I know, it's silly. It's supposed to be. Because if this is a person messing with you, we got a lot of jokesters and hucksters in Charles like to mess with tourists. They're taken aback by your very mundane, down-to-earth question. They expect you to scream, maybe throw the door in their face. But a real ghost won't respond. They won't respond at all, because this type of haunting is called a residual haunting. Residual hauntings are where the ghost does the same thing over and over and over and over again. Literally, it is caught in a loop. It sits at a location, does the same thing, pretty much till the end of time. At least what we think. In fact, this is the most common type of haunting you'll find here in Charleston. So to compare, the Wailing Woman is what we call an intelligent haunting. Every interaction with her is different. Not everybody has the same interaction with her. We have the same similar stories, woman crying, punch over the grassy area, walking around, grabs kids, drags them to the graveyard, but not everybody has the same interaction. Whereas with the residual hauntings at the Mills House, it's always the same every single time. So, by the way, this type of haunting is persistent, but also doesn't adapt well to its environment. There's actually been stories of people tearing down whole buildings and building whole new ones on top. The hauntings come back. They don't even follow the new floor plan, they follow the old floor plan. So if you somehow have the old floor plan, you overlay it, suddenly some of these hauntings make sense. It's also the reason why you'll sometimes see ghosts walk through walls. Good Lord. go. Good example of this is actually up over here on my right-hand side. This is actually the old state courthouse. This is actually one of the oldest state courthouses here in the country. Second oldest, second longest running one here in the States. Sorry, in the States. When I say the States, I mean the United States. And then on top of that, it's on top of the old fortress the British used during the Revolutionary War. So it's not uncommon to see men in red coat uniforms walking around here at night with their muskets over their shoulders. In fact, for a long time, we thought that this building was renting out space to a local theater group. Turns out state buildings aren't really known for doing that. So it turns out we're just seeing ghosts. Famous story back in 1996, a woman was trying to open up the courtroom for the day's proceedings, saw a man with a red coat jacket, musket on his shoulder, standing sitting near the doorway. Told him he wasn't supposed to be here, he was trespassing. He disappeared, she called the security, they had to shut down the entire building, they never found the guy. Another great story about that, had a friend who was a paralegal here about 15 years ago. She was about to leave for home, she'd been working all day, and she said she's about to leave about 4:15. And there was a call about a man walking around the building with a musket. And because it's, you know, a state building, not allowed to just let anybody do that. So they shut down the entire building. She couldn't go home until 6. Yeah, so like they take it seriously, which is why I always joke. It's a good thing I'm not a security guard there, because if it was, I'd be like, okay, can you describe the gun to me? Was it a musket? Was it something else? Because I want to go home. Right. I even kind of make this joke, like, I mean, 3 shots a minute. If you're good. Good. So yeah, I always tell people, if you happen to go there at night and you see those men in the windows walking around, that's not a theater group, actually it's ghosts. So, speaking of which, this particular area is called the Four Corners of Law. Four Corners of Law. It's because 3 of the 4 buildings here used to be courthouses. That used to be the county courthouse, now today it's town hall. That was the state courthouse we just talked about. Over there is the federal courthouse, used to be. That's actually today the post office. And then we have St. Michael's Church over here. St. Michael's is not a courthouse, never was. However, it's the oldest church here in Charleston, which is why we call this the Four Corners of Law. Only place in the United States we are surrounded by the 4 types of law that we live under. Town hall, town laws. State courthouse, state laws. Post office, federal laws. Church, God's laws, church laws, divine laws, religious laws, natural laws, a bunch of names for this one. But here in Charleston, we like to say this is the only place in the country where you can park not a single quarter, get your mail, get sent to jail, pay your bail, and pray you don't go to hell. Sorry, he's not a big fan of diesel engines. Alright, so, I'm not just stopping here to tell that joke, although it's one of my favorite jokes. This is actually St. Michael's Church, oldest church in Charleston, also called the Church of Midnight Rehearsals. So every now and then, let's see a woman in a cream colored wedding dress walk down the aisle of this church. Never quite make it to the altar. They say this is the ghost of Harriet Mackey. She actually died here on her wedding day, June 4th, 1804, a life old age of 17 years old. I know it sounds a bit like a soap opera, but it's not. Harriet Mackey was born to one of the wealthiest families in South Carolina. When she was 16 years old, she became the most eligible bachelorette because she was in line to inherit a massive family fortune. She caught the eye of a man named William Rose, died. Easy, buddy. Easy. Caught the eye of a man named William Rose. Didn't mean to say died, like I said, he actually pulled the rein. As I sang, ADHD is a gift and a curse at the same time. Okay, thank you. William Rose came from a very wealthy, well-connected, well-to-do family, as it turns out. He fell in love with her. She fell in love with him. And they decided to go and set their wedding date, June 4th, 1804. She fell asleep, but she never showed back up for the bridal walk. They would go check on her. They found her up in the pew, dead. Her skin was blue, her lips were purple. She had died of poison. Now, to this day, we have no idea who poisoned her or why. It's one of the greatest mysteries of Charleston. What's also quite fascinating is we have a portrait of her on her wedding day, done by a man named P.R. Valet. Yes, he painted her death portrait instead of her wedding portrait. I know that sounds kind of morbid, but back then that was actually very common. Whoop. I know it's green, but we're walking too fast. So, we'll have to hang out here for a second. As it turns out, P.R. Valet painted her portrait on a very tiny canvas about this big around, meant for a locket. And in this painting, it looks like she's just sleeping. She was very much dead. You'll see she's wearing the cream colored wedding dress, and she's got, there's 4 songs in her veil. It looks exactly like the woman they see walking down the aisle of the church. say that she's forever trapped in a loop. She'll always walk down the aisle of the church, but never make it to the altar quite. And if you do happen to see her get to the altar, she'll never walk back down the aisle. They say she's forever trapped in a loop until one day she gets to say, I do. Now her portrait is today at Yale Museum because Pierre Valet, very famous painter, all of his works end up in the most important big museums. So if you have to go up to Yale, you'll see it. It's a very tiny one, about that big around. Thankfully, we have a copy of it in the QR code website. Easy, buddy. Now, speaking of which, not all of our paintings are at Yale University, thankfully. Some of them are right here on the street corner. Look over here on my right. You'll see on that yellow building behind the street light is what we call the Hat Man. He was a mascot for a haberdashery or a hat making company here. Which is easy. There you go. Now, when we get closer, take a good look at him, you'll see that his eyes and mouth are boiler hats, nose is a sombrero, body, arms, and legs are top hats. He's also wearing a top hat. One ear is a Union cap, the other is a Confederate cap, and his feet are sailor caps. Now, what do y'all think? Kind of creepy, kind of cool, kind of cute. Then most people say creepy. Every now and then I got a carriage full of people say he's adorable. Usually ask what kind of anti-anxiety medications we're on at that point, you know. But here in Charleston, hold on a second. It's okay, buddy. Okay, thank you, buddy. They say at night, the Hat Man peels himself off the wall and he slips into the sewers. And he goes on the hunt for naughty children. Children that don't eat their vegetables, spend too much time on their phones, maybe don't do any of their chores. He'll wait until your parents fall asleep if you're not tucked in tight. He'll crawl up the bathtub drain, tiptoe down your hall, snatch you from your bed, drag you into the sewers, and never be seen again. You know, right? So, actually, do we have any kids on here? Are you a kid? You're 18? You're fine. You're kind of like a baby, but not really. You're fine. Yeah, you're somebody's baby, that's for sure. Usually there's always a parent looking at their kid like my favorite response to this was a 10-year-old boy about 3 months ago, shakily raised his hand. I said, what's up? And he's like, I'm from Texas. He doesn't eat kids from Texas, right? He only eats kids from Charleston. Like, I'm safe, right? And of course, I have a sense of humor, so I couldn't help it. I said, oh no, he loves Texas barbecue. Like,
oh, that's
I think his parents had a sense of humor, you know? Now, for the big kids among us, probably thinking, this sounds a bit like a Stephen King novel I might have read or seen the film adaptation of. Now I would say you're somewhat right. Stephen King used to hang out here in the 60s and the 70s. Is it likely that he's seen that painting? Maybe. Is it likely that he has heard these stories? Possibly. Yeah, and exactly. I can't say for sure. I actually read an article where he said his biggest inspiration for Pennywise in the novel It was actually a man named John Wayne Gacy. If you know who that is, sorry for bringing it up. If you don't know who that is, good, keep it that way. Trust me, you're not missing out on anything. But here in Charleston, we like to say that we inspired him, at least on a subconscious level, to create one of the most tourist villains of all time in his novel, It's Pennywise. So next time y'all watch Stephen King's It, you actually live in Charleston, like right there on the street. Now speaking of which, the people here of town, they tend to say the most haunted places in Charleston are either the Old City Jail or the Provost Dungeon right up ahead. Right up ahead is actually what we call the Old Exchange. Underneath it is the Provost Dungeon. The Old Exchange has got a lot of history. They actually do daytime tours here. Highly recommend y'all visit here in the daytime. But look on the sidewalk, you'll see there's these barred windows that wrap around the building. That is the Provost Dungeon. Excuse me. That's by design. The Provost Dungeon held all sorts of criminals. A lot of them were pirates, prisoners of war, petty criminals, violent criminals, but they're all underground. And this used to be, well, this is a bay. In fact, this used to be a dock. 1, 2, 3 street lights down. That's where you would see the waves lapping up against the shore in the 1700s. The ocean was very, very close back then compared to what it is today. So it's no surprise that when this area flooded, it was under sometimes up to 7 feet of water, especially during a storm. It flooded very quickly. And because the Provost Dungeon's underground, it's no surprise that it would flood almost immediately. I don't know if you've ever spent time in a room that's filling with water with people in it. I wouldn't call anybody's reactions rational. I mean, understandably so. The room is filling with water. Let's just get out of here. They were going to sit there and fiddle with keys, open up gates. They were going to leave. And it was every man for themselves. So it's no surprise that when this area flooded, there'd be thousands upon thousands of deaths. Now, do we have a way of knowing exactly how many people died there? No. We have no way of knowing. They didn't keep the greatest records back then, especially of prisoners. Sorry. It's always a marvel to gaze upon people's thought processes around here sometimes. Good boy, buddy. So, that being said, if you happen to visit the Provost Dungeon, I highly recommend you do. They do a lot of daytime tours there. You might find something there that piques your interest. Some people will sometimes see shadows in the corner of their vision. They'll sometimes hear whispering, humming, murmuring. They'll also sometimes hear water trickle. One of the most interesting facts. Some people feel an overwhelming sense of claustrophobia, almost as if they can't quite catch the breath, or they can't quite really breathe very well. They can't take a deep breath. So yeah, if you want to have a paranormal experience, I highly recommend the Provost Dungeon. You might get experience, you might not. Personally, you will not see me there anytime soon. I find it rather creepy. And that's saying a lot because I grew up in 2 haunted houses, so I know creepy. Good boy. So,
Where did you grow up at?
I grew up in Michigan. Yeah, I grew up in Michigan. Yeah, so fun fact about growing up in a haunted house. In the movies, they make it sound so terrifying. After a while, it's kind of like just having a roommate who does no chores and doesn't pay rent. I simply have a memory. In fact, it's actually happened here in Charleston as well. You'll hear a lot of people talk about who work here at these hotels. They'll just be doing their chores. They'll be doing whatever they're supposed to do. And they'll get crashing up in one of the rooms. And they'll be like, oh, Steve, dang it. And they named their ghost Steve or something like that. And they just kind of like, oh man, you gotta go up there and clean up Steve's mess again. So yeah, that's kind of the general MO here in Charleston. Like, oh yeah, they're there. We just kind of visit them. There you go. So, speaking of which, talk about pirates. Piracy was a pretty big deal back in the day. In fact, one of the more controversial subjects because people either really loved them or they hated them. Pirates actually helped out the economy quite a bit because we got some pretty cheap items from them. But there wasn't always times that we were benefiting. In fact, I would say there's a couple times that we were very much hating the pirates. For example, 1718, the great sacking of Charlestown. Right up here we have what's called Waterfront Park. Right beyond it, the entire Bay of Charleston. The lights across the way are Mount Pleasant and Sullivan's Island. The lights down over here is more of North Charleston. There are no lights out there except for blinking ones from buoys, boats, and maybe the fort. And that's pretty much it. That's the opening of Charleston Bay right there. So in 1718, the citizens of Charleston woke up, they looked out over the bay, they saw that there was 6 pirate ships blockading it. This was a problem. Not only was it the only way in and out of town, it was also the only source of food. We had 5 days of food left for the entire town. And the pirates were actually intercepting the food shipments coming in. They weren't throwing them in the ocean, they weren't eating them themselves, maybe they were eating a little bit of it, but not really. They're actually holding it over our heads. Now, these 2 pirates were actually Blackbeard and Stede Bonnet. So Blackbeard, the most notorious pirate in this corner of the world. They call him that because he had a large black beard that was just below his chest. He would tie rope into it, and he would light it on fire to make himself look more menacing, like a demon crawling from the depths. Now, I'll let you know, most of what we know about Blackbeard is more mythological than factual, so it's hard for me to give you an actual statement of fact of who he was outside of that. We think he was born as Edward Teacher, Edward Thatch, possibly in Liverpool. As to whether or not he willingly joined the piracy or whether he didn't, it's a little shady. Either way, he grew the ranks of the pirate lore. He also ended up becoming one of the most notorious villains of all time. So yeah, very popular figure. We actually know more about his cohort in this case, Stede Bonnet. Stede Bonnet was actually born and raised in Barbados, to one of the wealthiest families in Barbados. He married into another very wealthy family, to a woman named Anne, had 3 children with her, and you see, one day he just left. I mean, he had a very fruitful business. All he had to do was sit back and let the money roll in. But he decided not to. In fact, he bought a fleet of 6 ships, abandoned his wife and kids, and became a pirate. That's what we often call the world's worst midlife crisis. So, Stede Bonnet and Blackbeard, they're here in Charleston. They're blockading us from our food. They're holding it above our heads. On top of that, Blackbeard actually kidnapped some of our politicians and community leaders. He's going to start lobbing off heads if we didn't start coming up with some demands. What in the world do y'all think these pirates want in exchange for the city of Charleston and for some politicians' heads? Anybody got any questions? Sorry, anybody got any ideas? Anybody? What pirates usually want? Money, gold, silver, doubloons. No, it's actually medicine in this case. Medicine, specifically mercury. Mercury is not medicine. Please don't go home and start taking mercury for any reason. But back then, if you had a particular social disease, they say it could help. They say it could help. So, these pirates were actually trying to take 500 pounds of medicine. The Royal Navy loaded it onto their ship. Watched them sail over the horizon. Now, what I find fascinating about this, 6 months later, they found Blackbeard. It's fascinating because they didn't have satellites, they didn't have computers back then. How in the world did they find him? Because it's spy work. Spy work. Yeah. In fact, the British have been known for a long time for having excellent spies and excellent intelligence agencies. Why do y'all think James Bond is British? It's not because the accent's cool. It is because the British have always been pretty good at it. Look back at Revolutionary War history, the founding fathers are absolutely paranoid about it. So these spies had this idea that the pirates were actually around North Carolina's coast. The Royal Navy decided to go ahead and follow their advice. And 6 months later, in April of 1719, they found Blackbeard. They found him off the coast of Oak Island. They decided to go ahead and engage him in a fight. What better time than now? And it turns out, in the fighting, they were able to separate Blackbeard from his fleet. Hold on just a second. Excuse me. You know the drill. We have to wait. So impatient. So impatient. Yeah, he's 6 years old, you know. He's like 17 years old in human years. He's learning. He's learning. So that's what I was trying to say. They separated Blackbeard from his fleet. And they ended up separating from his fleet, and he had sustained 17 sword wounds from sword fights. He had sustained 8 gunshot wounds. He finally slowed down enough for somebody to chop off his head. And even then, they say that Blackbeard's headless body jumped off the ship, swam around it 3 times. Now, is that last part true? Probably not, but it's very popular in the areas around North Carolina where you visit. In April, they actually have a festival every year where they recreate Blackbeard's beheading and him swimming around the ship 3 times. It's actually really fun. Now, what happened to his skull? It was actually taken up to Chesapeake Bay where it was displayed as a deterrent from pirates, but there's a legend here in Charleston. That was brought back here where somebody chopped off the top of it right above the brow, lined the interior crane with silver, put emeralds in his eye sockets, replaced his teeth with gold teeth. They call this the cursed drinking chalice of Charleston. It's an accursed cup, makes random appearances around town. They say it appears next to you almost a guide by an invisible hand. The liquid inside looks like blood. If you drink from it, you're cursed. But nobody's ever drank from it, lived to tell the tale. So who really knows what happens when you drink from this cup? Personally, I think this sounds like a cautionary tale about taking strange drinks from strange people. Personally. Now, by the way, I got one final story for y'all. It's actually my favorite. It's about Lavinia Fisher. Now, Lavinia Fisher is considered the first female serial killer of South Carolina. I like telling her story because I like celebrating women's rights and women's rights. Good boy. It's always really fun in Women's History Month, too. Always like, Happy Women's History Month. Good boy. So, Lavinia Fisher. She's actually the first female serial killer of South Carolina, but her story is kind of shrouded in a lot of mystery. We think that her and her husband owns this inn 6 miles from Charleston, called the 6 Mile Inn. And because it's a more remote location, they had a hard time getting patrons. They were sometimes known for stealing from their sleeping patrons just to make ends meet. Usually cash, clothing, jewelry, what have you. After a while, they thought it's much easier to steal from dead patrons than living ones. So, Lavinia Fisher had very good looks, was very charming, had a way with words, and had a way around people. She concocted this idea that she would figure out where they were from by being very charming, kind of put down their defenses. And then she would give them her signature sweet southern tea. Now, her signature sweet southern tea was actually just oleander, a very poisonous plant that grows around Charleston. Very poisonous. Do not hold on to the leaves for more than a minute. You'll start developing heart palpitations and a little bit of numbness and even paralysis in parts of your body that are holding on to the leaves. Ask me how I know. So, they say that she would steep these leaves and then she'd add a bunch of sugar to it just to make sure it was palatable. Give them to her patrons. They would die of heart failure. And then they would take all their belongings, get rid of the body. How many victims Lavinia Fisher had. Some say she had maybe 3. Others say thousands. Personally, I don't know how many people she killed. I've looked into this. I've been very interested in her story for a long time, but there's even some evidence that she probably didn't kill anybody. Possibly. But we do think that she maybe at least tried to kill one, because in 1829, it all came crumbling down for her and her husband. A man named Joseph Harris, came from Savannah, Georgia. Decided that he was going to stay at the 6 Mile Inn instead of here in town. Turns out he wasn't a tea drinker. So every single time she offered him tea, he'd pour it into a potted plant. Now eventually, he went to bed, none the wiser to what was happening. He woke up in the middle of the night. Miss Fisher was breaking into his room. He stood up, looked at her in the doorway, and I think there was this moment where she was like, "Why are you still alive?" And he's like, "Why are you in my room?" Good boy. But her husband came around the corner with an axe for just as such occasion. And Joe Harris put together. He figured out what was happening. He jumped out the window that he was staying in, except it was on the 2nd floor, so he broke his leg in the process. He hobbled the 6 miles through the woods to the Charleston Police Department, reported everything that happened. Next day, the Fishers were arrested for attempted murder and highway robbery. Weirdly enough, they both confessed. Both Fishers confessed to trying to kill this man and take all his belongings, which is a hangable offense. However, this is Charleston in 1829. They did not want to hang a married woman. Back then, it was considered morally reprehensible to hang a married woman. However, there was no laws against hanging unmarried women and widows. So the judge decided to go ahead and make an exception. Decided to hang her husband on a Wednesday and her on a Thursday. That way she'd be able to be a widow. So, Rebecca shows up to her own execution in her wedding dress. She was trying to appeal to any single man in the audience who were willing to ask for her hand in marriage and save her from the gallows. By the way, this actually was a thing back then. There actually were desperate single men that would use the hangman's noose as a dating service. It wasn't very common, but it was a thing that would happen. Now, Lavinia Fisher thought for sure, with her good looks, her charm, her wedding dress in tow, somebody had to ask for her hand in marriage. Unfortunately for her, rumors are powerful currency in this town, and they had heard rumors that she was a poisoner. Nobody was going to ask for her hand in marriage at that point. So they say, swipe left, no thank you. She went up onto the gallows, and she looked out over the audience. She slapped the executioner's hand out of the way, put the rope around her own neck, said, "If anybody here has a message for the devil, let me know now. I'll be dying with him tonight." And then she threw herself off the gallows. I know, right? So by the way, that's actually one of the reasons why people love Lavinia Fisher. She's iconic. It's not the fact that she killed a bunch of people. It's the idea that she showed up her own execution in her wedding dress, said she was going to die with the devil. That's iconic. So, her ghost haunts the Old City Jail. If you have to go by the Old City Jail, you might actually sometimes see her walking by the windows in the middle of the night. In fact, she was the official, unofficial mascot of the trade school that used to be there. The students loved her. They said that she's like a Bloody Mary figure. If you went to the bathrooms in the middle of the night, you would sometimes see her staring out from one of the bathroom windows. I'm sorry, from the bathroom mirrors. But on top of that, I myself have actually talked to her without even realizing it was her. I actually went to go visit the Old City Jail some years ago. A friend of mine was a tour guide there. And I was walking around the Old City Jail after they had closed. And I saw a woman, long black hair, in a old white dress. I wouldn't call it a wedding dress, but it definitely was an old white dress. And she was walking around and hanging out in one of the jail cells. I went over and I thought she was like a living history guy. So I went over and I was like, "Hey, are you just back here trying to freak people out?" And she just stared at me. And she didn't say anything to me. And I thought, okay, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. You know, some people in living history are a little more serious than others, that's fine. So I walked away. And as we were leaving, I realized I didn't see that woman walk out. So I looked at my friend and I said, "What about that lady with the black hair and the white dress? Is she gonna leave yet?" And they said, who? I said, "Didn't you have somebody who worked in living history in one of the jail cells back there?" And they said, "Oh no, that was Lavinia Fisher you saw." I had no idea who she was. I had no clue who she was. So my friend, on our way back to our hotel, told me the story. So apparently I saw Lavinia Fisher try to strike a conversation with her. I mean, I couldn't even describe what she really looked like. She just had long black hair, green eyes, white dress, and she had, I'd say, like a very angular face. And it turns out we do have a photo of her, and I would say it looks almost pretty much like what I saw. So yeah, it kind of freaked me out for a long time. I always tell people though, if you go there, definitely be careful. They say that if you take pictures of any gravestones there, one of those gravestones might be her. And there's this legend that if you take a picture of her gravestone, you or a beloved family member will die in a car accident within the year. I don't know how true that is. I just know don't take pictures of the gravestones. Good boy. All right, so my final trick up here, this is actually what we call equine parallel parking. This is where we really earn those tips and those treats. His favorite tips are Guinness, Honeycrisp apples, and pears. He's also a big fan of molasses cookies. Any tips that you give by cash out, Venmo, I just split with my horse because he deserves a treat more than I do. Whoop. After all, he's all the one doing all the physical labor, and me, I'm just talking. Whoop. So when you get up here, please exit on the right. Do not exit on the left. You will be ghosts in tomorrow's ghost stories. And thank y'all so much for coming. Y'all been wonderful. If there's anything else I can help with, oh, you're very kind. I appreciate it.